Okay, this is the first lesson on samples and surveys, which is the last lesson that we're going to cover before your district exam. And as I've mentioned before in some previous videos, that specifically is for the 2020-2021 school year, which is the year that I am recording this particular video. So if you are watching this video in another year, disregard anything that's specific to this school year. So what we're going to talk about in this is samples and surveys. This particular lesson is going to focus on sampling strategies, and then the next lesson in the video series is going to focus on surveys, like how you ask questions and then looking for bias and such. So first vocab that we want to define here is a population. A population is defined as all the members of a set. We haven't talked a whole lot about sets in this class, but a set is simply a group of something. It could be a group of baseball cards or coins. In this particular lesson where we're talking about surveying, when we're talking about the population, we're talking about a set of people, okay? And the population would be the set of people that we're interested in. Your population could be all students at Atlantic Coast. It could be all teenagers, all Floridians, all Americans. Your population could be all Americans of Hispanic descent, okay? It could be just some group that you are interested in information about that group, okay? Now, the problem with populations is that there's usually way too many people in a population for you to study all of them. And so what you have to do is you have to take a sample. And a sample is defined as part of a population. So instead of studying the whole population, you just study part of the population. So there's an illustration in there from whatever year it was that I typed the notes up that says pollsters want to get a sense of how people in Florida plan to vote in the upcoming presidential primary. It is not possible for them to ask every single potential voter. So what do? They take a sample. Okay, so they... All right, I had a little bit of break in the recording there, which I know you guys can't tell that I did, but I did. So they would take a sample of the voters in Florida to see how they want to vote. And if you pay attention to news and headlines, you'll know that polling, especially political polling, has come into question recently because the way that the polls are saying people are going to vote hasn't corresponded with the way people have actually voted when they've gotten to the votes. And so that calls into question how they're taking their sample. Right. And that brings us to the next group of notes, which is there are different ways that you can take a sample. And they have pros and cons to pretty much all of these. The first way is to take something called a convenience sample. And this is exactly what it sounds like. You select people who are convenient. And this is probably the strategy that you would use if I assigned you to do some kind of poll. My MGF students have to do a poll for me, and this is the strategy they use because a lot of times you don't have the resources to do other kinds of polling. So you poll the people that are closest to you. So if you guys were given a project where you had to conduct a survey, you might poll your classmates, the people sitting around you in class, your friends, the people on your bus, your family, people in your church or your mosque or your synagogue or your Boy Scout troop or on the soccer team or whatever. You would poll those people because those are people that you're going to see anyway. The big disadvantage to convenience polling is that, or convenience sampling, is that people who think and act and behave alike tend to hang around together. And so if you were to poll like only the soccer team or only the lacrosse team, you would only be getting like student athletes. And so depending on what your poll was about, you might get some really wrong impressions about the students at Atlantic Coast. Okay, if you were only polling student athletes. So a huge advantage is that you can get your poll done quickly and you might get some good data out of it. It really just depends on whether or not that sample is a good sample for the population you're looking for. Next one here is something called a self-selected sample. And this is where you ask for volunteers. And an example of this, so essentially this is where you would maybe throw out like a lot of invitations to say, hey, I'm doing this project. Maybe you put it on SurveyMonkey or something. You put your questions out there and then you blast it out all over social media and say, hey, I'm looking for some volunteers. Can you answer some questions for me? So that can be like, I mean, it can work and it can give you some valuable information. But you can't force people to participate, and the people who are likely to participate might all share some other common characteristics. An example right now of a self-selected sample is this. You might have seen this in the news, and I mean, if you never watch the news, like try to do that, like, or read some articles or something. This is the Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System. So if you get a COVID vaccine, you get information on this particular program. They call it VSafe. And what it is a way to report to the CDC any adverse effects. So whether you come down with a fever or you're tired or your arm hurts or whatever it might be, or like obviously things that are much more serious than that. And so you can opt in to this particular program and they'll send you a reminder every day and they'll pretty much say, how are you feeling? And they'll do that for a while after you get your shot. But ultimately, it is a volunteer system. So some people are not comfortable maybe sharing that information with the government. And they're like, nope, I don't want to participate. Other people are like, they need all the information they can get. Sure, I'll participate. It does require like access to like a cell phone. So if somebody doesn't have a cell phone or they don't have a smartphone, then they're not going to participate. So it's ultimately still a volunteer thing. And that means there might be some inherent bias in, well, we're going to define bias in a little bit down here, in what your data is saying. The next one is a systematic sample, and that's when you order your population and then you choose from that, like according to some kind of pattern. Okay, so order the population and then choose with some kind of pattern. So you're probably wondering, like, well, what would that be? Actually, I think the next thing, we'll do some examples, but that could be like putting the people like in alphabetical order. Like a common way that we order the population is we do alpha order by last name. Okay, so that's how you guys are listed in Focus. At least on my end, you're listed in alphabetical order according to your last name. But you can also like order people by their height or their age or like any number of ways. And then you might choose every fifth person. So you would pick some kind of pattern, and after you put them in order, like now you're going to pick every fifth person. Okay, that's what systematic sampling is. And then random sampling is this, and this is an important definition to remember. Random sampling is when all members of your population are equally likely to be chosen in your sample. And I'm going to do, what am I going to do? I'm going to take the black and I'm going to underline the words equally likely. Random sampling is considered the gold standard. And you'll remember from a previous lesson that doing things randomly is actually not that easy for us to do as human beings. We think like with patterns, and so we tend not to do stuff randomly. So if you're going to do stuff randomly, you have to like draw things out of a hat. You have to, shuffle the deck of cards. You have to use the random number generator. But all members of the population would be equally likely to be represented in your sample. All right, and then bias. Bias is when one part of the population is over or underrepresented. So when one part of the population is over or under represented. And that means your results are going to end up being skewed. So a couple of ways like that can happen. It can happen a lot of different ways. And we mentioned over here, the polling recently, there's been, accusations that like the news agencies are not doing things randomly and that they're oversampling Democrats and underrepresenting Republicans or whatever the issue might be. And so for whatever reason, the polls aren't reflecting what they're supposed to reflect. The vaccine reporting system, I don't know what the data is on that, but for some reason I want to say like women are more likely to participate in that. People that are less skeptical of the government, people that are more skeptical are not going to want to participate in that. And so you might end up with weird little pieces of your population being overrepresented. Like if you overrepresent women, which of course would mean you underrepresent men, then like with the vaccine side effects, well, if women are more likely to have certain effects than men are or less likely, now the data coming in does not represent all of the people getting the vaccine because you're getting your information from certain places. Bias doesn't have to be like a horrible thing, but it is really, really important that you recognize it and you recognize those possible sources of bias. So that if your data is biased, that you're able to say, here is a potential source of bias. And I've read several like research papers recently on the vaccines and on COVID and stuff. And there's always like a piece in there that says, here are the possible biases in our data. Like we were not able to control for like this, that, or the other thing. So let's go back to the illustration. Suppose you want to find out how your classmates would vote in the upcoming election. So if we had an upcoming election, which we don't at the moment, thank heavens, but if we had one, and you wanted to know how your classmates would vote in that election, what would be an example of each of the sampling strategies listed above, and would there be bias in there in that strategy? So a convenient sample would be ask your friends or the people nearby. PPL is people, okay. And that's convenient because they're your friends. You're going to hang out with them anyway. And if you're shy, you don't really worry about asking your friends, and asking some total stranger in the cafeteria is a lot more daunting. But maybe you'd be comfortable asking the people sitting around you in class or the people in front or behind you on the bus. You say, hey, how would you vote in the upcoming election? Now, is there bias in doing that? That really depends on your group of friends. But generally speaking, people who have similar political views do tend to gravitate towards each other, like in social settings. And so there is a possibility that depending on who your social circle is, that you might be tilted towards, voting for a particular candidate. And then that wouldn't necessarily represent all of your classmates at Atlantic Coast. So possibly there's bias, and you want to recognize like you can't control for this, so there is potential bias. Self-selected sample, you could make an announcement and ask people to participate. So maybe you could have Mr. Kushner put together an announcement for the morning raise. And, he says, this poll is here. Here's like the QR code for it, participate in that. But ultimately what you're doing is you're asking for volunteers. Now, one way that this can end up being biased, and it's again difficult to know whether it would make a significant impact on your results, is that people who tend to volunteer think very or feel very strongly about an issue or a candidate. Okay. So if you're really, really, really in favor of a particular candidate, you're like, oh yeah, I want to get my vote in. I want to make sure people know what I think. Or if you're very opposed to a particular candidate, you're like, I got to get my opinion out there. People who are on the fence, people who aren't sure, people who don't care, they're not likely to respond. And so you are going to be missing the element of your population of maybe people that won't vote. So if you have like, I'm going to vote for candidate A, I'm going to vote for candidate B, and I'm not planning to vote, you might not get a lot of the people saying I'm not planning to vote because they're not going to vote and they're not going to participate in your poll either. All right. Systematic could be get an alphabetized list and choose every 10th name. So we'll say get an alpha list. That just means alphabetical by name. And choose every 10th name. So you go down to the main office, you say, I'm doing a poll. I would like a list of every student in the school alphabetized by their last name. And somebody hands that to you. I don't think they would, but somebody hands it to you, and then you go through that list and you pick every 10th name, and then you track that student down and you say, like, who are you planning to vote for? That is probably not very biased. Because there's no correlation between the alphabetization of someone's last name and political affiliation, at least not anything that I've ever heard. So someone with the last name that starts with the letter W is equally likely to choose candidate A or candidate B. As the general population. So that's probably like a very good way to get it. And then a random sample is you could put everybody in the school, their name in a hat, and you just choose from the hat, okay? And you just pick names. And that should not be biased because there's no other things that could tie people together. Now, it also doesn't mean that you're going to get great results. You can do it randomly and still get like skewed results from your poll. And like going back to like some recent elections and stuff, there's been like ideas thrown out that people lie when they're being polled, that they actually don't want to disclose who they're going to vote for. And so they're not telling the pollsters the truth. So it can get kind of messy and kind of sticky. But what you do need to know is the 4 different ways that people can be sampled and be able to identify what kind of sampling strategy you're looking at. And whether there's bias in it. Okay. So, and this component right here, will there be bias? And it's okay to say like there's possibly bias. So if you were going to, say do convenient sampling and you were going to do like the soccer team and your polling was on the, physical education programs in Duval County Public Schools, then you're probably going to have some bias because now you're dealing with a population of student athletes. If you were going to poll the soccer team about their favorite flavor of cake, probably not too biased because there's not really any relationship between whether someone plays soccer and what their favorite flavor of the cake is. But if you were doing like people on the soccer team and their opinion of physical education, like now you can see where that might be biased. So you want to be aware of that. And it is messy. So we have here, a newspaper wants to find out what % of the city population favors a property tax increase to raise money for local parks. So the city council or whatever is thinking about raising property taxes. That would be taxes only on people who own property. So people who rent apartments would not be affected by that tax. And they're raising the money for local parks. What is the sampling method used for each situation? Does the sample have a bias? And explain. So the first one says a newspaper article on the tax increase invites readers to express their opinions on the newspaper's website. This is a self-selected sample because you're just tossing it out there and whoever responds, responds. It might have bias. So notice that they are like hedging that depending on who visits the website. The people who respond may overrepresent or underrepresent some views. For example, some property owners who are against the tax might organize a campaign to get friends and neighbors to visit the website. So because it is voluntary, if there are people that feel very, very strongly against the tax increase, then they can actually coordinate like a response, get the news out and say, hey, everybody, go here and vote this way. And that's going to skew your results. You're also, I've had students, point out that not everyone has internet access. So, or would be able to go to the website. My dad still thinks like the internet is inside a computer. Okay. Like he doesn't, and so he's not going to go to a website and he's not voting on anything. So he would not be represented. Second option is a reporter interviews people leaving the city's largest park. This is a convenient sample since it's convenient for the reporter to stay in one place. So the reporter just goes there and interviews people coming out of the park. Because the location is near a park, the sample may overrepresent park supporters and the result will have bias. So because you're going to a park, it's not like everybody there is going to favor a tax increase. That's not true. But if you're going to people that will benefit from having the park or like investment in the park, then they're more likely to support that tax increase because they personally stand to benefit from it. And the last one is a survey service calls every 50th listing from the local phone book. This is a systematic sample because the phone listing is ordered alphabetically. The regular sampling interval is every 50 listings. This sample may have bias if there is some link between people who are listed or not listed in a phone book and people who pay property taxes. Because people who pay property taxes are less likely to favor the tax increase. Okay, not universally. Okay, it's just less likely. And so if there is some connection between owning property and having your number in the phone book, then you're going to overrepresent people who would not be in favor of it. But it's not a sure thing that would happen. So you would have to investigate like how is the phone book put together and such. All right, so here's one for you to do. I would like you to pause the video and in your notes, write down your answer to this, like how you would respond to it if you were answering this question on your own. Okay, so it says to survey the eating habits of the community, employees of a local television station interview people visiting a food court in the mall. What sampling method are they using? And does the sample have bias? And explain. So sampling method for this would be convenience. If you did not put convenience, okay, make the correction in your notes. But you should have your answer in your notes there. Because they're just going to park themselves at the food court. Does the sample have bias? And explain. So you should have some writing, okay? And if I'm checking your notes on Focus and you actually have the words some writing in your notes, so help me, I'm not giving you full credit for that, okay? Some writing. You should have something written down on your page for what you think the bias might be. And when we've done this in class and we've had the class discussion, students have kind of been all over the place. Some people said like it would be biased in favor of people who eat junk food because a food court isn't known for having like super healthy food and people with really healthy eating habits aren't going to hang out in a food court. Other people have said, no, like a food court always has a wide variety of places and there's always like the salad place and the healthy sandwich place or whatever. And so you are going to get people that are more health conscious at the food court. Other students have said it's biased, like against people who maybe wouldn't have the money to eat at a food court, or they don't, like, that's not how they would choose to spend their money. So you have like a financial issue there. And if there's a connection between how much money you have and your eating habits, which there generally is a connection there, then you would be overrepresenting people who had the money to eat in a food court and shop at a mall in the first place. Second question there is, a poll of every person in the population is a census. What is a situation that requires a census instead of a sample? So why would we need to know like stuff about every person in the United States? Some of the answers that might come up for that is military and the draft. That is an answer that's come up before. Representation and your congressional lines. So you know that like the House of Representatives is done based on population. And so if pieces of like certain centers are growing in population or decreasing in population, it actually affects where those lines are drawn. You might want to know it for like taxing purposes. So Texas can you expect to come in? So you should have something in your notes written down for that. You cannot, after this video, upload your notes. So do not upload your notes until you watch the video on surveys.